Chicago, 1978. A city that prided itself on its booming suburbs, its safe streets, and the warmth of its community life. But beneath the painted smile of one man, a horror was festering that would shake America to its core. His name was John Wayne Gacy. To neighbors, he was the reliable contractor, the cheerful host of Bob, the man who dressed up as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at hospitals and charity events. But behind that mask of laughter hid one of the most prolific killers in American history. By the time investigators finally uncovered his secret, 33 young men and boys had fallen victim to him, 33 lives extinguished, their bodies hidden in the crawlspace beneath his suburban home, or discarded in nearby rivers. The staggering number alone was enough to make the nation shudder. The thought that so many could vanish without anyone connecting the dots for years exposed not only the brutality of one man, but also the blind spots of an entire era. Imagine the scene. The house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. An ordinary two-story home in Norwood Park Township. On the outside, it looked like any other middle-class residence. The lawn was trimmed, the driveway often full of cars during social gatherings. But beneath the floorboards of that home lay the rotting corpses of dozens of boys and young men. The smell seeped into the walls, yet neighbors shrugged it off as something ordinary. Maybe sewer issues, never suspecting the nightmare hiding beneath. To put this into perspective, the investigation into Gacy's crimes would span months, cost law enforcement agencies hundreds of thousands of dollars, and involve the painstaking recovery and identification of victims whose families had been left in agonizing uncertainty for years. Detectives and forensic experts would endure psychological torment as they unearthed bodies one by one. The earth beneath Gacy's home becoming a mass grave that revealed the scale of his monstrosity. And yet, the most disturbing detail wasn't just the body count. It was the mask. A mask painted in red, blue, and white. The smiling face of a clown. For decades, clowns had been symbols of childhood innocence, laughter, and harmless entertainment. Gacy weaponized that image. He used it to disarm suspicion, to gain trust, to cloak himself in normalcy while committing unspeakable crimes. This horrifying duality, the community man and the killer, the clown and the predator, became the very reason his story still lingers in America's darkest folklore. By the late 1970s, the country had already been rattled by other killers. Ted Bundy in the Pacific Northwest, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam in New York. But Gacy was different. His crimes weren't the random acts of a shadowy stranger lurking in alleys. They happened inside a home in plain sight, committed by someone everyone thought they knew. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a trusted neighbor. That was the betrayal that cut deepest. The shock value of this case cannot be overstated. Parents across America looked at clowns differently after Gacy. Communities that once felt safe in their suburban bubbles suddenly realized that monsters didn't always come with fangs or claws. Sometimes they wore a suit, shook your hand, volunteered at the community center, and sometimes they painted their face to make children laugh. This is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of a mask, of deception so perfect that it fooled an entire town, even as people disappeared, one by one. Over the next hour, we will peel back that mask, layer by layer, tracing how John Wayne Gacy rose to power in his community, how suspicion grew, how the truth was finally unearthed, and how his crimes changed the way America sees trust, neighbors, and the symbols of innocence. And before we begin, a reminder. This channel, Mr. True Death, is for those who dare to look at history's darkest shadows. If you are drawn to stories where horror is not fiction but reality, where ordinary streets hide unspeakable truths, then subscribe, because we have much more to uncover together. The story of John Wayne Gacy is not for the faint of heart. It is a descent into duality, into charm laced with evil, into a crawlspace of nightmares. And it begins here, with a smiling clown who left behind 33 ghosts, buried beneath the floor of his home. Before the horror unfolded in Chicago, John Wayne Gacy was, to most who knew him, just another ordinary man chasing the American dream. Born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Gacy grew up in a working-class family. His childhood was not the stuff of warmth or comfort. His father, an alcoholic and a violent man, belittled him constantly. Young John was called weak, soft, even mocked for having health issues that kept him from playing sports. The humiliation left scars deeper than bruises. It carved out in him a desperate hunger to prove himself, to be admired, to be seen as respectable. But like many who wear a mask, Gacy learned early how to smile through pain. Teachers remembered him as polite. Classmates thought him unremarkable. And by all accounts, his early years gave no hint of the monster he would become. If anything, Gacy seemed driven by a need to belong. That hunger shaped his life in ways both ordinary and sinister. By the late 1960s and 1970s, Gacy built a life that seemed picture-perfect on the surface. He ran a successful construction business, hiring young men from the neighborhood. He was politically active, even taking photos with prominent figures like First Lady Rosalind Carter, wearing a smile as wide as any politician. He threw loud parties, welcomed neighbors into his home, and presented himself as the model suburban citizen. If you asked his friends or colleagues, they'd have said, "John, he's a little odd, sure, but harmless, a good man." Even then there was Pogo the Clown. Gacy volunteered at children's hospitals, birthday parties, and community events, painting his face in bright colors, twisting balloons, telling jokes, and laughing with kids. To parents, he was delightful. To children, unforgettable. The clown costume gave him a way to be adored, to be the center of attention. But it also provided something far more chilling. A disguise so convincing that no one dared to look beneath it. This dual existence became the defining feature of John Wayne Gacy's life. On one side, the charismatic community man. Respected, trusted, beloved. On the other, a predator who prowled for vulnerable boys and young men, often those in need of work, shelter, or guidance. Gacy knew how to manipulate trust. He knew the weaknesses of others, because he had spent his whole life hiding his own. Neighbors later recalled small things that unsettled them, but never enough to trigger alarm. The strange hours he kept, the smell around his house that he brushed off as a plumbing issue, the fact that so many young men worked for him, but none seemed to stay long. Looking back, the signs were there, but at the time, they were easy to ignore. After all, who would suspect the man throwing charity events, shaking hands with mayors, and entertaining children as a clown? The mask worked, and Gacy knew it. His life was a carefully constructed stage play, where every role he played, businessman, politician, clown, neighbor, distracted from the role that mattered most, predator. Yet even in his public persona, cracks sometimes appeared. There were whispers. Some young men spoke of Gacy's strange behavior, his unpredictable temper, his attempts to lure them into situations that felt wrong. But in the 1970s, in a society where young men often ran away and police resources were stretched thin, these warnings went largely unheard. Gacy counted on that. He exploited the blind spots of his community and the failings of law enforcement. It's chilling to think that at the same time Gacy was donning clown makeup and making balloon animals, he was also luring young men back to his home with promises of jobs or drinks. It was as if the face paint itself symbolized his entire life. Bright colors covering shadows, laughter masking screams. Understanding the man behind the mask is crucial, because Gacy wasn't a faceless monster hiding in the dark. He was visible. He was trusted. He was admired. And that is what made him so terrifying. Evil that hides in shadows is frightening, but evil that smiles at you across the street, invites you to a party, or waves to your children, that is the kind of evil that lingers in the imagination long after the case is closed. As we move forward in this story, remember this duality. Remember how normal he seemed. Because it is precisely this normalcy that allowed John Wayne Gacy to kill, again and again, for years, without anyone realizing that a suburban home in Chicago was slowly becoming a burial ground. The 1970s were a time when America was still adjusting to a new cultural landscape. The Vietnam War had ended, trust in government was fractured, and crime rates were climbing across major cities. In Chicago, missing person cases were often treated with a shrug, especially when it came to teenage boys. Police assumed they were runaways, kids escaping strict households, or chasing the counterculture dream. That blind spot became John Wayne Gacy's shield. The first signs of his predation began quietly, almost invisibly, hidden behind the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. Young men and boys started disappearing, but the cases rarely made headlines. Some were last seen at bus stations, others leaving their jobs, and more than a few were connected to Gacy's construction company. He had a clever routine. He offered work, quick cash, or even just a friendly drink, for vulnerable youths, some estranged from their families, some struggling to make ends meet. Gacy's offer seemed like a lifeline. In reality, it was a lure. Families of the missing began to notice disturbing patterns. Parents would report their sons gone without explanation, only to be told by authorities that they were likely fine, probably off on their own adventures. Frustration mounted as mothers and fathers tried to insist that their children were not the type to vanish. But at the time, police didn't see a connection between the disappearances. Gacy was careful, methodical. He staggered his crimes, kept his facade intact, and relied on the dismissive attitudes of law enforcement. The few who crossed paths with him and survived told chilling stories later. Gacy had a trick, they said. He would invite boys to his home, then show them handcuffs, pretending it was all a magic act. Once the cuffs clicked shut, the game changed. For some, there was escape. For others, the night ended in silence that no one heard, except for the dirt beneath his crawlspace. One of the earliest hints of Gacy's darker side came in 1968, years before his most notorious crimes. He was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa, serving time in prison. Yet, through good behavior and manipulation, he was released after only 18 months. The system handed him back his freedom, and he wasted no time resuming his predatory behavior. It's one of the most haunting what-ifs in American criminal history. What if Gacy had served his full sentence? How many lives would have been spared? As the decade wore on, Gacy's confidence grew. He threw louder parties, entertained more children, expanded his business. The mask worked so well that he seemed untouchable, even when rumors circulated. When some boys whispered about Gacy's strange advances, his drunken rages, or the eerie feeling of being around him, the whispers died out quickly. Who would believe that the local contractor, the clown, the political volunteer, could be a predator? The chilling truth is that the first signs were there, hidden in plain sight. The strange smell around his property, brushed off as faulty sewage. The high turnover in his construction company, where young employees simply disappeared from the job without a word. And the police reports of missing boys, dismissed as unimportant. Because in the 1970s, teenage boys were rarely seen as victims. These oversights created the perfect hunting ground for Gacy. He thrived on invisibility, not by hiding in the shadows, but by standing in the open. By being the man no one suspected. Each missed chance to stop him emboldened him further, turning suspicion into silence and silence into death. It wasn't until December 1978, when a single boy, Robert Piest, vanished after telling his mother he was meeting a contractor about a job, that the illusion began to crack. That disappearance would prove different. Robert wasn't a runaway. He wasn't troubled. He was a well-liked teenager, with a strong family presence, and his parents would not be dismissed. Their persistence forced police to look closer at John Wayne Gacy, and for the first time, the mask began to slip. But before Robert's case triggered the downfall, Gacy had already killed dozens. The ground beneath his home was heavy with secrets. The first signs were there, ignored, overlooked, and tragically lost in the noise of a society not ready to see a clown as a killer. December 11th, 1978. Winter had already settled over Chicago, and with it came the case that would finally unravel the carefully woven mask of John Wayne Gacy. On that night, 15-year-old Robert Piest, a cheerful boy with plans for his future, told his mother he'd be back soon. He was meeting a local contractor who promised him a job that paid well. That contractor was Gacy. Robert never returned home. This disappearance was different. Robert's family knew him well. He wasn't a runaway. He wasn't troubled. He was a grounded teenager with no reason to vanish. His parents refused to accept the dismissive answers the police had so often given to other families. They demanded action. Their persistence forced investigators to take a closer look at Gacy, and what they uncovered was the first crack in a dam about to burst. When detectives questioned Gacy, he was smooth, confident, almost arrogant. He insisted he had nothing to do with Robert's disappearance. He had answers for everything, a story for every detail, delivered with the charisma of a man who had spent his life fooling people. But beneath that smile, investigators sensed something was off. His alibi had holes. His demeanor seemed rehearsed. Still, there wasn't enough to arrest him outright, so they watched him. Day and night, surveillance teams followed Gacy through Chicago. What they saw only deepened the mystery. He seemed to live two lives at once. By day, he was the charming neighbor, running errands, laughing with friends, keeping up appearances. By night, he slipped into bars, picked up young men, and prowled the streets. The surveillance team recorded his every move, and as they pieced together the puzzle, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Meanwhile, investigators dug into Gacy's past. The 1968 conviction for sexual assault resurfaced, a detail that suddenly loomed large. They learned about his business, where young men seemed to cycle in and out with alarming frequency. They interviewed neighbors who complained about the stench around his property, dismissed as sewage problems. They heard whispers about the strange things that happened inside his home. The more they learned, the less the mask held. As pressure mounted, Gacy began to unravel. His arrogance wavered. He drank more heavily, drove erratically, even bragged to acquaintances that he was connected to murders. It was as though he knew the walls were closing in, and part of him wanted to confess, while another part fought desperately to maintain control. Finally, the police secured a warrant to search his home. At first, the search yielded only fragments of suspicion. Some items that clearly belonged to young men, but no body, no smoking gun. Yet even these fragments painted a troubling picture. Objects that could not be explained away. The investigators left that night with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense of dread. Then came the moment when the horror began to surface. During a second search, one officer noted the overpowering smell in the house, particularly near the crawl space. It was not sewage. It was the unmistakable odor of decay. A simple observation changed everything. The crawl space beneath Gacy's home became the focal point. Digging there revealed the first set of remains. The scene was beyond comprehension. The soil gave way to human bone, the unmistakable fragments of lives cut short. As detectives pulled back, the enormity of what they were facing sank in. This wasn't a one-time crime. This was systematic. This was ritual. This was the work of a man who had been killing for years. Word spread quickly through the police department. They had found a graveyard beneath a suburban home. The house at 8213 West Somerdale was no longer just a residence. It was a tomb. And the man who lived there, the smiling clown, the community volunteer, was not just a suspect. He was a predator, whose crimes stretched further than anyone dared imagine. As the investigation deepened, Gacy's calm exterior finally cracked. He alternated between boasting about his crimes and pleading innocence, a bizarre dance between arrogance and denial. But the discovery of Robert Piast's disappearance had triggered a chain reaction. One missing boy had pulled the mask from Gacy's face, and now the darkness was spilling out. What investigators didn't yet know was just how deep the crawl space went, and how many souls were buried in its soil. On December 21, 1978, the final act of John Wayne Gacy's charade began to collapse. Investigators, now armed with solid evidence and the overwhelming stench that could no longer be ignored, secured another warrant. This time, they weren't coming to browse. They were coming to dig. As officers descended into the crawl space beneath Gacy's home, their flashlights cut through the heavy air, illuminating beams and dirt that hadn't been disturbed in years. Or so it seemed. The soil was damp, uneven, oddly packed. A detective pressed a shovel into the earth and almost immediately struck something that wasn't stone. It was soft, unnatural. When the dirt was brushed away, the shape of a human bone revealed itself. Silence fell over the team. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was real. The more they dug, the more the horror unfolded. One body, then another, and another. The crawl space was a labyrinth of shallow graves, a twisted archive of Gacy's hidden life. The smell became unbearable, the kind that clung to clothes and skin, haunting everyone who entered. Investigators had to take shifts, because the air was thick with rot, but they pressed on. With each shovelful of dirt, they were pulling lost sons back into the light. Imagine being one of those officers, crouched beneath the floor of a suburban home, realizing you are standing in a burial ground. Corpses wrapped in plastic, bones jumbled together, victims stacked almost like firewood. Some still had rope burns visible, evidence of the torture they endured. Others were so decomposed, they could not be immediately identified. It was as though Gacy had built his own underground kingdom of silence, confident no one would ever look there. But now, the world was looking, and the discoveries did not stop. As word spread, more officers joined in, each one taking part in the grim excavation. It wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was history in the making. The house on West Somerdale was no longer just an address. It was the epicenter of one of America's most horrific serial murder cases. Meanwhile, Gacy sat in custody, watching the facade he had built crumble. He knew the truth was out. At times, he smirked. At other moments, he seemed almost relieved. As if carrying the weight of 33 bodies beneath his home had finally broken even his twisted sense of control. The community around him reacted with shock that bordered on disbelief. Neighbors who had attended his party's parents, whose children had laughed at his clown performances, political allies who had shaken his hand. They all asked the same question. How could this man, this smiling clown, have hidden so much horror in plain sight? Over the following days, the crawl space yielded more and more victims. Some bodies were pulled from the nearby Des Plaines River, where Gacy had dumped those who no longer fit beneath his home. Piece by piece, the full scope of his crimes was revealed. Each discovery brought pain to families who had clung to hope for years, now confronted with the cruel reality that their sons, brothers, or friends had been buried in darkness just miles away. By the time the digging stopped, the number was clear. 33 confirmed victims, 33 families forever scarred, 33 lives reduced to evidence bags and autopsy reports. And for the investigators who worked the case, an unshakable memory of crawling through the dirt beneath a killer's home, surrounded by the dead. The raid on Gacy's house wasn't just the capture of a killer. It was the unearthing of a truth too grotesque for the imagination. It forced America to see that evil didn't always lurk in the shadows or wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes, it hid beneath the floorboards of a friendly neighbor's house, dressed in bright makeup and a painted smile. The crawlspace had spoken. And with it, John Wayne Gacy's reign of secrecy was over. When the walls finally closed in, John Wayne Gacy no longer had the energy, or perhaps the desire, to keep up his mask. In the interrogation room, the once smug contractor who boasted of his political connections and his clown performances began to unravel. What came next shocked even the most hardened detectives. At first, Gacy danced around the truth. He shifted blame, claimed he was being harassed, and even suggested a conspiracy against him. But the mountain of evidence was undeniable. The bodies pulled from his crawlspace, the belongings of missing boys found in his possession, the stories from survivors who had escaped his tricks. And so, little by little, Gacy began to talk. The way he confessed was chilling. He didn't speak like a man haunted by his actions. He spoke like someone recounting mundane chores. He described how he lured young men, offering them jobs, money, or simply a drink. Once inside, he would bring out the handcuffs. "It's a trick," he would say, pretending it was a clown routine. Once they were restrained, there was no escape. He strangled many of them, often with a rope, in what he casually called his rope trick. Some deaths, he claimed, were accidents. Others, he admitted, were intentional. But the indifference in his tone was the most terrifying of all. When asked why he buried so many in the crawlspace, Gacy responded with unnerving practicality. "I had no choice." He shrugged, as though disposing of human lives was no different than managing garbage. The crawlspace became his private morgue, organized in sections where he placed victim after victim. He even drew maps for investigators, pointing out where he had buried each body. To him, it was just logistics. To the world, it was unimaginable cruelty. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his confession was the duality he maintained. At times, he described himself as two people, the hard-working citizen, and the darker figure who took control. He blamed this other side for the killings, insisting that not all of him was guilty. It was a twisted attempt at self-preservation, but it also revealed how deeply fractured his psyche truly was. Psychologists who later studied Gacy described him as a textbook psychopath, manipulative, remorseless, and skilled at wearing masks to get what he wanted. But even that definition felt too neat, too clinical, for what investigators were hearing firsthand. This was not just pathology. This was evil given flesh and a painted smile. One detective recalled how Gacy casually sipped a soda while describing where he had dumped bodies into the Des Plaines River, as if he were giving directions to a local diner. Another remembered the smirk that appeared on his face when he realized the police still didn't know the full count of his victims. To Gacy, these confessions weren't burdens. They were trophies, proof of the control he held, even after capture. Yet, even as he confessed, Gacy insisted he wasn't entirely responsible. He spoke of being a victim of his abusive father, of feeling rejected by society, of being misunderstood. It was a strange mixture of arrogance and self-pity, as though he wanted to be remembered not just as a monster, but as a tragic figure. But the sheer scale of his crimes drowned out any sympathy. By the end of his confession, the truth was undeniable. 33 confirmed victims. Their lives ended in a suburban house, their bodies hidden in the dirt beneath a clown's floorboards. The number hung in the air like a curse. Even seasoned officers admitted they had never seen anything like it, and never would again. John Wayne Gacy's confession wasn't just a catalogue of murders. It was a revelation of how evil can hide in plain sight, smiling through grease paint, shaking hands at political rallies, and offering jobs to the desperate. It forced America to confront a reality more terrifying than any horror movie. That the monster could be your neighbor, your friend, even the clown at your child's birthday party. With the confessions recorded, and the bodies recovered, There was no turning back. The stage was set for one of the most infamous trials in American history. A trial where the smiling mask of John Wayne Gacy would finally be ripped away in front of the world. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in February 1980. And from the very first day, it was clear this would be no ordinary courtroom drama. The eyes of America were fixed on Chicago. Journalists swarmed the courthouse. Sketch artists filled notebooks. And the families of 33 murdered boys and young men crowded into the gallery, waiting to see the man who had stolen their sons face justice. Gacy, however, seemed unfazed. Dressed neatly, his hair combed back. He carried himself with the confidence of a man still convinced he could talk his way out of anything. At times he joked with guards, smirked at cameras, even appeared bored as prosecutors described the atrocities committed in his home. That calm arrogance only deepened the nightmare for onlookers. How could a man responsible for so much suffering behave as though he were the victim? The courtroom became a theater of horror, with each day peeling back another layer of the grotesque reality Gacy had tried to keep buried. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The items belonging to missing boys found in his possession, the chilling maps he drew of his crawlspace, the testimony of survivors who narrowly escaped his handcuff trick. Each detail landed like a hammer blow, forcing the jury and the public to confront the scale of his brutality. The defense, desperate to save Gacy from execution, leaned heavily on an insanity plea. They argued that no sane man could commit crimes of such magnitude. They painted him as a split personality, a Jekyll and Hyde figure, whose other self-committed murders, while the good citizen persona remained oblivious. Psychiatrists were called to debate his state of mind, with some describing him as a paranoid schizophrenic, others labeling him a true psychopath. But the prosecution dismantled this defense with devastating clarity. They highlighted the methodical way Gacy carried out his crimes, luring victims, restraining them, killing them, then carefully disposing of their bodies. This wasn't madness without reason. This was calculation, control, a predator making deliberate choices. One prosecutor summed it up to the jury. John Wayne Gacy knew exactly what he was doing, and he enjoyed it. As the trial progressed, the sheer weight of testimony crushed any illusion of Gacy's innocence. Jurors listened to heart-wrenching accounts from the families of victims, mothers and fathers who described the agony of years spent searching for their sons, only to learn they had been buried in a crawlspace. Some wept openly in the courtroom. Others stared coldly at Gacy, refusing to give him the satisfaction of their grief. Through it all, Gacy remained unnervingly composed. He doodled during testimony, whispered jokes to his lawyers, and occasionally rolled his eyes at the prosecution. To many, it was the final insult. The killer clown, still performing, even in chains. After weeks of testimony, the jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. 33 counts of murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of sobs, gasps, and finally, a sense of release. For the families, it was the confirmation of what they had feared but needed to hear. Gacy was responsible. He would pay. Then came the sentence. The judge, staring directly at Gacy, declared that his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. Death. 12 times over, one for each capital count. It was as though the system itself was trying to match the enormity of his crimes, with a sentence equally heavy. For the first time, Gacy's mask slipped ever so slightly. He fidgeted, his jaw tightened, his face pale. The smirk was gone. In that moment, the man who had hidden beneath a clown's smile, who had manipulated neighbors, friends, and victims alike, stood exposed. The monster was no longer in disguise. The trial of John Wayne Gacy didn't just convict a murderer, it became a national spectacle that forced Americans to question how someone so ordinary, so embedded in the community, could commit such extraordinary evil. The courtroom had revealed the darker side of human nature, and the world would never look at a clown the same way again. But Gacy's story did not end with the verdict. He still had years left to spend on death row. Years he would use to keep himself in the spotlight. Years where his arrogance continued to provoke outrage. And ultimately, years that would lead to one final chapter. His execution. After his conviction, John Wayne Gacy was transferred to Menard Correctional Center, where he would spend the next 14 years on death row. For most, the sentence of death would bring silence and reflection. But Gacy was not most men. Instead of fading into the shadows, he seemed to revel in the attention his crimes had brought. In interviews, he played the role of victim, insisting he had been framed, that the police planted evidence, that others were involved in the murders. He denied responsibility for most of the 33 deaths, twisting his words into contradictions that infuriated the families of his victims. He described himself as a lovable clown, mocking the very nickname that had made him infamous. It was as if he thrived on the outrage, feeding on the horror he had caused. Reporters, fascinated by the grotesque spectacle, continued to seek him out. Gacy never disappointed them. He smirked for cameras, spun elaborate lies, and sometimes even laughed when describing the accusations against him. For the public, it was a reminder that his arrogance had survived prison walls. Even behind bars, Gacy found a way to perform. He began painting. His artwork, often depicting clowns, skulls, and surreal images, was sold and exhibited, sparking outrage and fascination in equal measure. Some collectors treated his work as morbid trophies, while families of victims saw it as salt in an open wound. How could a man who had buried their children in a crawlspace now profit from their pain? Yet, Gacy thrived on the controversy. The more people despised him, the more he seemed to enjoy his notoriety. But no amount of denial, no amount of manipulation, could erase the weight of his sentence. Appeals dragged on for years, as Gacy's lawyers tried every angle to delay the inevitable. Each time, the courts reaffirmed the same conclusion. John Wayne Gacy would die by lethal injection. As his execution date drew closer, Gacy continued to play games with the public. In one interview, he sneered at the accusations, saying, "I'm the 34th victim." He tried to recast himself as a martyr of a corrupt justice system. But no one was buying it. Too much evidence, too many bodies, too many families broken. The world knew exactly who John Wayne Gacy was. May 10, 1994. After 14 years on death row, the end finally came. The media swarmed Illinois Stateville Correctional Center. Crowds gathered outside, some carrying signs demanding justice. Others selling t-shirts that read, "No tears for the clown." The atmosphere was electric, as though the entire nation was watching to see if the monster would finally be silenced. That evening, Gacy was given his final meal, a dozen fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC chicken, French fries, and fresh strawberries. It was a grotesque echo of his past. Before his crimes, Gacy had once managed several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Even his Last Supper seemed to carry his twisted sense of irony. Shortly before midnight, Gacy was led to the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as calm, even smug, still carrying the same air of defiance he had worn throughout his trial. Strapped to the gurney, he looked out at the witnesses, many of them relatives of his victims, waiting for the words he would leave behind. His last statement was as chilling as it was dismissive. With a smirk, he muttered, "Kiss my ass." And then, as the lethal chemicals flowed through his veins, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, was gone. At 12:58 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, when the news broke, crowds erupted in cheers. Fireworks lit the sky. For the families, it wasn't closure. No execution could ever bring back their sons. But it was something. Justice, finally, had spoken. The end of John Wayne Gacy was not the end of his story. His paintings would continue to circulate. His name would continue to haunt the cultural imagination. And his crimes would live on as a warning that sometimes evil wears a smile, shakes your hand, and waves from your front yard. The clown was gone. But the fear he created was only beginning to take root. When John Wayne Gacy was executed in 1994, many believed the nightmare had finally ended. But the truth is, his shadow never left. Even in death, Gacy continued to haunt America. Not just in the memories of the families whose lives he destroyed, but in the cultural psyche that could never again look at a clown the same way. The case forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it shakes your hand, throws neighborhood parties, and makes children laugh. That betrayal, the violation of trust, became Gacy's most enduring legacy. Parents looked at clowns differently. The painted smile, once a symbol of innocence, now carried an undercurrent of menace. Across America, coulrophobia, the fear of clowns, began to spread, and it was no coincidence. John Wayne Gacy had transformed one of the happiest icons of childhood into a mask for horror. His crimes also reshaped law enforcement. In the 1970s, missing teenage boys were often dismissed as runaways, their cases deprioritized or ignored. Gacy exploited that blind spot. After his arrest, police departments across the nation reevaluated how they handled missing person cases, especially when it came to vulnerable youths. New protocols, databases, and investigative methods emerged in the years that followed. A grim reminder that sometimes it takes tragedy to force change. Culturally, Gacy became a macabre figure of fascination. Books, documentaries, films, and even horror novels drew inspiration from his double life. Characters like Stephen King's Pennywise, the dancing clown, owe part of their terror to the shadow Gacy cast over the image of clowns. Pop culture turned him into a symbol of hidden evil, a reminder that monsters don't always look monstrous. But beyond the headlines and the folklore, there were the families. 33 young men and boys. Each one had a story, a future, a life cut short. Their names are often overshadowed by the man who killed them, but they are the ones who should be remembered. For their families, the fear never truly faded. Every holiday, every birthday, was marked by an absence that could never be filled. For them, Gacy's legacy was not a cultural icon. It was a permanent wound. Even today, decades after his death, John Wayne Gacy remains a subject of debate. Was he a product of his abusive upbringing, or simply evil incarnate? Was his clown persona a disguise, or the purest expression of his twisted psyche? These questions linger, not because they excuse him, but because they force us to look at the unsettling possibility that monsters like Gacy may not be as rare as we hope. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was eventually demolished, but the ground beneath it will forever be remembered as a graveyard. The soil that once held the remains of 33 victims now serves as a chilling reminder of what can hide in plain sight. The neighborhood has moved on, but history never forgets. And so we are left with the question: how many more masks walk among us? How many faces we trust, how many neighbors we greet, might hide unspeakable darkness behind their smiles? The story of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, is not just a tale of one man's atrocities. It is a warning, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often those who look the most ordinary. And while Gacy is gone, his shadow lingers, painted in bright red smiles that will never again feel innocent. So I'll leave you with this. When you see a mask, whether it's a painted clown's grin, a politician's handshake, or a neighbor's friendly wave, do you ever wonder what lies beneath? Tell me in the comments what you think. Could another John Wayne Gacy exist today, hiding behind the very same masks we trust? Or have we learned enough from history to see through the smile? Because if Gacy taught us anything, it's this: the mask may be colorful, but the truth beneath can be darker than we ever imagined.